Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name's Ryan Streeter, and I'm the Director of Domestic Policy Studies here, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this event featuring Tim Carney's new book and a discussion about its findings and claims. And I think you'll find both Tim's remarks and the panel of interest, particularly timely, given the moment that we find ourselves in historically right now. And so I look forward to the discussion. Tim is going to come up and offer a few words, and then he will be followed. We will follow that with a panel discussion with Charles Murray, who's known to probably everybody here, AEI's own, the F.A. Hayek Chair in Culture Studies here at AEI, and then Megan McArdle, whom is probably also known to all of you, a Washington Post columnist with a lot to say on this issue as well. Tim is a visiting fellow here at AEI, and he's also the commentary editor at the Washington Examiner, where he's been a columnist for a while, and you're probably all aware of his columns. His previous books on cronyism are what many of you probably know Tim for, the big ripoff in Obamonomics, and that's where Tim really carved out a name for himself in the intellectual kind of milieu and space here in Washington. But this new book, Alienated America, is a new enterprise for him, a real deep dive into what's going on in the heartland. And I'm holding this book up because you need to buy it. It's easier for me to say that than for Tim to say it. And you should go out there and pick up a copy on your way out if you didn't pick one up on the way in. They're for sale out in the hallway. And so Tim will give us a few remarks followed by this discussion, and then we will allow time for engagement with you, for a question and answer period to follow. And our rules here at AEI is that you're brief and that your questions are in the form of a question. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome Tim up here. Tim, please come and give us your thoughts. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ryan. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Again, my name is Tim Carney. I'm a visiting fellow here. I'm also a full-time journalist. So what I did in Alienated America was try to find out new things and tell a story with my reporting and lots of data. And a lot of you guys noticed, probably in 2015 and 2016, there was a sudden surge in interest among the political press in looking at working-class places and going to Appalachia and going to parts of the Rust Belt, places where the American dream seemed dead. In writing this book, I started at the opposite end. I started in the opposite place, near my house in Chevy Chase, Maryland. A lot of you guys heard about Chevy Chase when Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation was going on, but that's part of sort of lesser Chevy Chase. If you guys know, there's a Chevy Chase, D.C., a town of Chevy Chase, something called Chevy Chase Section 5. But then there is the elite Chevy Chase, called the Village of Chevy Chase. Population of 2,000. It is the wealthiest municipality in the wealthiest region, in the wealthiest country in the history of the world. And it's also got, 80% of the population there or so has college degrees, including a majority of men and women. You've got about half the population has advanced degrees in Chevy Chase. But here's an important thing, and you would know this if you've read Charles Murray's Coming Apart. It's not just wealth. It's not just material ways in which they're doing well. There's all sorts of positive outcomes. 95% of the families there have two parents at home. I visited there a few times, and at the Village Hall, they have all these events. They have, a father-daughter dance. You go there, and they have kids' movie night where the teenagers in the town watch their kids so the parents can go out and have actual dinner in town. This is of sort of immense value that they have there. I'm a dad. My wife, Happy Valentine's Day, Katie, is here. We have 6 kids. Something that allows you to get away from your kids is one of the best ways to foster your love for your kids, is my opinion. But they also have classes for the elderly in the Village Hall there in Chevy Chase. They have sports teams for the kids. And again, the outcomes are excellent. The kids get married. The kids, more than most kids, stay away from drugs. They go off to college. They avoid unwed pregnancy. So these elite villages, like Chevy Chase, all around the country, they produce these good outcomes. Because, as a wise woman once said, it takes a village to raise a child. And a village like Chevy Chase is exactly that sort of village. And speaking of Hillary Clinton, if you look at her list of top fundraisers, the Hill Raisers, she's called them, people who raise 6 figures, a dozen of them at least live in Chevy Chase. there. So this is a liberal elite town that practices the values that conservatives preach. And if you pay attention to liberal wonks, you'll often find that what they are trying to do is make more of the U.S. population be like Chevy Chase. They just wish the elites have such good outcomes. Maybe we could make more of them like us. If we throw more money at public schools, maybe your Kennedy Public School in Silver Spring can have the same outcomes as Langley High School in McLean, Virginia. Or they say, well, maybe if we make college free, because college is associated with so many good outcomes, just make college free and then everybody will have all these good outcomes. I would argue, and I'm not going to belabor it here, you can't make everybody in America be an elite. It takes a village, but the village of Chevy Chase is not a scalable model. So in Chapter 1, I visit another village. It's called Oostburg. Oostburg is in Wisconsin. It's about 50% of the population there claims Dutch ancestry. When I was there, I sat at a diner, the Chevy Chase median house is $1.5 million. In Oostburg, it's $150,000. You could go and buy 10 homes in Oostburg for the price of one in Chevy Chase. And the median income is slightly above average in Oostburg, but not if you control for the fact that the number of family households is way above average in Oostburg. When I was there sitting at Judy's Diner on a Sunday, in walked a big crowd leaving the 9 a.m. service at the First Reformed Church and the 9 a.m. service at Bethel Orthodox Church. And then a little while later, and by the way, I'm a Catholic, so I always thought that church always lasted an hour, but some of these things go on for hours and hours. So they're coming in with all their kids. 9:15 First Presbyterian Church service let out a little later, and after that in came the crowd from the 9:30 at the First Christian Reformed Church. This small town village of 2,000 has 4 different Reformed churches, plus an evangelical church, and a bus to take you to the Catholic church out of town. This village has the same great outcomes as Chevy Chase. When I asked one of the guys there sitting at the counter, he was a mechanic, he still had the grease under his fingernails, I said, what do you think of this village? He says, I'm going to tell you one complaint I have. I went to the Christmas concert the other day, a few months back. There were no seats at my kids' Christmas concert left because all these people who didn't even send their kids to the public school were there watching the Christmas concert. So I yelled at my neighbor. I said, hey, Jimmy, why are you're taking up my seat? And Jimmy, who doesn't have any kids, said, well, we had to come watch our kids. And so that phrase, Robert Putnam used that as a title of one of his books. In Oostburg, the kids are our kids to everybody. So these are the two models. How is Chevy Chase like Oostburg, or like Salt Lake City, or like these other conservative religious places out there? They both have very strong institutions of civil society. Whether it's the Chevy Chase Country Club and the sports teams there, or the First Reformed Church and the First Christian Reformed Church, or Our Home Christian Ministries, which spun out of all these churches together, or the Christian schools or the public schools, the strong religious communities and the elites get good outcomes, not because of government programs they run, but because they have the strong institutions of civil society. So what is the plight of the working class where they're struggling in America? It's that they lack those institutions. Alienation is the plague of middle America. We talk about the factory shutting down, and that's certainly a factor. But the real problem is the church is closing down. Because I talked about all the secular institutions that can exist, but for middle class and working class, the church has always been, the church, the synagogue, the mosque, the church has always been the central institution of civil society. Secularization of America, then, has been tolerable for the elites, although they haven't secularized as much as a lot of conservatives think, but it's been tolerable. Secularization has been deadly for the working class and the middle class. That's what I argue. That's what I think I establish in Alienated America. And I want to thank you all for coming, and I couldn't think of two better people to talk about this with than Charles Murray and Megan McArdle, who have written on these themes a lot. So thank you guys, and let's have a conversation. So Megan, I'll let you go first.
Oh God, I have so much I want to say about this book, which I loved, and not just because my husband is thanked in the acknowledgments. full disclosure, I did not see this book before publication. He cannily withheld it from me so that I could panelize on it. But I will read my favorite passage from the book, because I think that this really sums up sort of both the insight and the challenge of what Tim points out. He talks about the death of diners, where, I saw this in my mother's hometown, right? Like the Dunkin' Donuts opens up and there's a drive-through and it's fast. And so my grandfather, who got up at 5:30 every morning for decades and decades and went to the diner to get his toast and his eggs, that place is slowly dying off, right? And Tim says, losing the diner means losing a meeting place. Over the years, this would weaken the connections between neighbors. You may say there's nothing keeping neighbors from getting together anyway after they've finished their breakfast and coffee at home. Heck, now they can meet at a park or wherever they want because they're liberated from their need to go to a diner. Well, this sounds rational. It also obviously ignores how human social interaction works. Our more obvious and more immediate needs bring us together, and the coming together fills the less obvious but still very real needs. We come together for food, drink, or security, and we end up gaining from camaraderie. Deprivation in these less obvious needs is often not noticeable in the short run, but is devastating in the long run. And I read that and I think about an observation that science fiction writer Robert Heinlein, of all people, once made, which was that everyone complained about the suffocating nature of extended family networks in small towns. And if you read fiction from up to about 1950, this is like a dominant theme, is how terrible it is. And then it went away, and we suddenly realized that it had indeed been suffocating and all the rest of it and demanding, but that it had also provided a lot of stuff that we really missed when it was gone, but you couldn't see it like a fish in water until it was gone. And so I see us in a lot of ways, and I will say that I think I'm a great admirer of both Tim's book and of Charles's book, and I think that the weakest part of both books is what is the weakest part of almost every book, which is the obligatory what is to be done chapter. And if I had my way, we would just X that chapter out of books, because I think that describing a problem is often all by itself incredibly valuable. I think Tim and Charles have both recognized the difficulty of this, and with proper humility rather than like the one secret thing that will fix this problem. But the question I always have at the end of recognizing problems like this, right? Because it really is a problem of, in some of the ways that the old welfare systems arguably created a situation in which people were making completely rational short-term decisions. That welfare was economically better for them in the short term, but because they stayed out of the labor market in the long term, it made them more unemployable and created more problems. Then in the same way, all of these things are completely rational short-term decisions, because the costs of building that camaraderie, the costs of building that network on any given morning when you are deciding whether you're going to drive to, spend an hour at the diner or drive through the Dunkin' Donuts in 5 minutes, at any given moment, the costs are more apparent. It's only over the very long term that the benefits you're losing become apparent. And so the question I have, and this is not a question I expect either of them to answer, but I think a question that we have to answer collectively, is what do you do when the incentive structure of society is setting things up so that people are not thriving, but in which, how do you alter that incentive structure? Is the government cannot mandate that we go to church. So how do where do we do the work, and how do we do the work?
You're a libertarian, I'm a libertarian, and this works. Well, no, it doesn't work, but it gets a laugh usually, which is that when it comes to the solutions, and I'm a libertarian, libertarians don't do solutions. And it is true, however, that everybody continues to ask you to give one.
Yes.
Actually, as I was thinking of coming on the panel today, and I was deciding just how gloomy to be, because, in many ways the book's kind of upbeat, and you see functioning communities, and I applaud that, Tim. I just wonder if you've looked at the problem closely enough to retain, if you still retain that much optimism. And I go back to Coming Apart. One of the least discussed parts of Coming Apart was my chapters on the founding virtues, where I was going back to the founders and I was saying, well, they disagreed in a lot of things. All of them said that there were a few things that were necessary for this society to function, for the Constitution to work. And if they were religiosity and honesty and industriousness. What was the fourth? I hate it when that happens. These were characteristics of the American people that were going to enable the Constitution to hold together. And you take a look at the trends in the working class, and they are devastating. You said briefly but correctly that secularization has not progressed as far in the upper middle class as people think. The pointy-headed intellectuals, yeah. You go to the faculty of Harvard University, and they do a survey, and they're all atheists, basically. But you go to the upper middle class, and there's been some secularization, but it's kind of leveled off, and you still have maybe 30% who have a strong affiliation with a church or place of worship. You go to the working class, where I thought was the backbone of religious support, and it's just, you know, if you use the general social survey, you're down around about 12% of people in the white working class, which is the sample I was looking at. In the white working class, about 12% have a meaningful attachment to a church. When you only have 12% in a community, then they do not provide a kind of core around whom various kinds of civic functions revolve. They're kind of oddballs when you're 12.5%, whereas 30% you're still in the game. Okay, so religiosity has diminished. The whole notion of morality, that was my fourth one. You needed a moral people, yeah. I don't know if you've noticed, nobody talks about virtue anymore because the left has always been a little down on virtue as being preachy and judgmental and so forth. May I just observe, it's very embarrassing for conservatives to talk about the importance of virtue and character these days. I'm not going to get into an argument about any national leadership here. I'm just going to observe that if you say, well, what you really need in a political figure, starting out before anything else, is character, because everything ultimately stems from character. Character is destiny, and apart from that, you want something you can hold up to your kids. And the rest of that conversation is completely silent, and it will continue to be silent for the indefinite future. Well, guess what? Madison says the idea that a free people can exist without virtue in the people is a chimerical idea. And it is. The United States, our communities don't function in the absence of a strong sense of virtue. And here's where maybe we can get into an argument of some kind here, or at least a back and forth. A central theme of Tim's book is the importance of religiosity. And that's, you know, Steve Pinker, I wish he were on the panel, because it would be fun. It would be fun to have Steve on the panel with Enlightenment Now, who would say, no, you don't have to have that. I think Tim's right. I'll make just one other comment before we go make it more of a back and forth. And that is that folks, this is what happens when you're 76. You forgot what you were going to say. Well, Tim, I'm going to let you jump in.
It happens to me at 46.
Yeah. So thank you for bringing up virtue, because that's, I think, the theme throughout the book. And I came up with a classical education, and Aristotle teaches us virtue is a habit. And one of the things about habits is they require practice. So a few different times I use the idea of sort of, what about it? What if you lack sort of the gymnasium in which to practice virtue? And what is a strong family? What is a good elite public school? What is a good church community? These are these places where these can be practiced. Now, I think church communities are the only ones that do that very well, because the elites won't call these virtues. They're sort of best practices. Well, the reason you stay married and get involved in your kids' lives is because your kids then have the best outcomes and you have the best outcomes, which is the way sociologists talk about it. And I think that that's the thinking in the Chevy Chases, the Grosse Points, the Ann Arbors of America. And so you worry about sort of the fertility of that virtue to pass down through multiple generations. As you put it and others put it, too many of the liberal elites are unwilling to preach what they practice. But it's a good line, but it's not just about preaching. It's about building the infrastructure where the virtue is being exercised, where people are being trained to it, where family formation is only really possible in a strong community because it does take a village. So I do think virtue is the most important thing, and again, the unwillingness to talk about it means that the people who have these virtues and know that they're virtues are too likely to keep them to themselves because it sounds preachy.
So let me push back on a couple of things. First on the virtue idea, and second on the pessimism idea. And on the virtue idea, I will say that I don't think that it's true that the left doesn't believe in virtue. The things that are becoming sacred in that space are different, and it's about fighting oppression, right? And that, I would say, is the leading virtue that the upper middle class liberal people are extremely interested in imparting to their kids and schools and all the rest of it. Now, we can argue about whether that is a good virtue or not, but it is a virtue. It has a lot less to do, however, it is true with family formation, right? And it is, in a lot of ways, a less personal virtue, right? It is less likely to make you personally thrive and more likely within a community, but very possibly more likely to make other people who are struggling to thrive in a larger systemic oppressive architecture. So, I mean, you should take that seriously as a claim to virtue. I think it is one. And the second, I'm not even sure this is pushing back on the pessimism, is perhaps reframing the time frame, right? Is like, in a lot of ways, this book, like every book on the topic, ends up anchored in the 1950s. And there's a really simple reason for that, which is we have a lot of good data from the 1950s, and we don't have a lot of good data from 1910, right? But what we do know about 1910 certainly paints a different picture from what we see today. For example, I would say that geographically, what you see in 1910 is highly dense, thick social communities in rural areas and extremely fractured communities, much like the ones described here, in urban areas and in these sort of outposts where a lot of immigrants are arriving. They're all from somewhere else. They don't have a thick network. If they have an ethnic cohesion, they may develop one, but often they don't. And certainly for those initial 5-10 years, it is a brutal experience for those immigrant groups, even after you discount the brutal physical labor that they've been shipped out to the middle of Pennsylvania or what have you to do. So we've had these problems before, and they got better, right? Like religiosity, for example, attachment, or defining that, you can define it in different ways, but defining it as attachment to a church, post the Puritans, it peaks in the United States in the 1950s, right? And so we tend to get these decline narratives. I mean, this is also true of progress narratives, right? Like there's a kind of idea of the sexual revolution that like it's just going ever forward in one direction. In fact, like there was an 18th century sexual revolution in Britain, and then it was followed by Victorianism, in which they were just like, stop, back, right? So, you know, the idea that this is all going in one way and it is all, I think that is very possibly false, is that we're in the middle of a big economic dislocation that I think is fracturing communities in many ways. We're in the middle of a big cultural dislocation that is fracturing communities. I think technology is fracturing communities, and that in a way we've got, technology is really good for the outliers and not good for the median. Like if you think about what 1950s society is like, to me it's a society that is organized around making the mean best off. Right, and that's just true on every level, from economic to political and so forth. What we have now is a society that is organized around the outliers, and that's both the outliers on this end and on that end. That's what social policy ends up organized around. It is what our economy is organized around. It maximizes for the outliers, and it sort of neglects the mean. But that's kind of what you would expect in a period of dislocation. But, we've had these technological disruptions before. I mean, I've remarked in a column that it's sort of really interesting that these big disruptive social movements in the 20th century, basically followed by about 10 years, disruptive communications innovations, right? Radio comes in the 20s. In the 1930s, we get fascism, and in the 1920s in Italy. TV comes in the 50s, and in the 60s, we get the 60s, and not just here, all over the world, right? Is that society is probably eventually, like these things when they disrupt, they break patterns that were sustaining and that people had figured out how to maximize to make their lives better and their communities better, right? But that people are incredibly robust. If you think about what frontiers were like, right? They were terrible in the 1880s. They were horrifying. People are shooting each other and there are serial killers stalking. And then by 1925, Wyoming is a kind of family-oriented, nice place to live, right? So the fact is that people have an instinct for doing this and they will rebuild new forms, but that doesn't mean that, the transition can be decades. And I think in particular, and then I will stop because I know I've talked a lot, but I think in particular of a very interesting conversation I had with a colleague of mine at Bloomberg who grew up, who had actually descended from, if anyone is familiar with Orwell's The Road to Wigan Pier, which is about sort of just total desperate poverty in the north of England during the 20s and 30s. He actually, he had grown up very near there. Wigan Pier is no longer there, but the area. And his grandmother had lived in these just, gross slums. I mean, if you read this book, you're just horrified by the physical description of the conditions people are living in. And his grandmother had moved out in her 60s to a council house when the government was renovating everything. And he said it killed her, and he's just the outrage in his voice. And he said she had all her friends, she knew everyone, and then they moved her to a council house where she was in the middle of nowhere and she didn't know anyone, and she decided to die. Right? She just got sick of life. And if you think about that, is these houses that are 2 or 4 tiny rooms, squalid, crawling with bed bugs and vermin. They have toilets that are at the end of some little back alley that you have to share often with other families. If you think about a community, and a community in which coal mining and the worst sort of industrial manufacturing was what, and decades of unemployment was what was binding this community together. These were people who nonetheless, in the worst, almost the worst conditions than we can imagine compared to somewhere like Oostburg, had built something that was sustaining them and was so important that when it was forcibly taken from them by a government that was trying to make their lives better, they declined. Well, and so think about that. Yeah. That is the optimism, is that is what humans do. We do sustain ourselves.
Humans do that, and I want Charles to talk. The humans do that unless there are forces that are actively and continuously pulling us apart. In other words, you're describing almost a gravity of bringing people together, and sometimes there are forces, specific forces that pull us apart. And I think right now we do have a lot of those with technology and government that I worry will persist for at least a generation. The big government sort of being, as Tocqueville predicted, hating other gatherings, other things that can be a locus of love besides itself. And I just worry that these will have staying power, that even when we do overcome them, it'll be a couple generations.
I think that's right. I mean, part of the thing is, right, we went through Dickens, and what ended was with this vibrant community in the north of England. But, it took a long time, and it was miserable for a generation or two while they transitioned to it.
Okay, maybe it won't work everywhere, ever. So we have the community that we like, whether it's Chevy Chase Village or Oostburg or whatever, and those kinds of human connections are really important. I fully agree with Megan's point. The 50s were about the mean, and now policy's about the outliers. Okay, why is it that you had in the 20s and 30s and 40s Main Street and these other books and Babbitt and all of these, decrying this stifling, conformist, boring middle America? Well, it was because the people who were writing those books were intellectuals who were really bored hanging out with those people.
They were the outliers.
and so they go off. But now you see the intellectuals have their own communities they can go to. They have communities that work. What about the megalopolis? Maybe there is no such thing as going home again in terms of of cohesive communities in the modern American megalopolis. I just put that up there as a hypothesis. But I will say this, that I think if you talk about the great divide in the United States culturally, it's not left and right so much as people who live either in small towns or small cities or people who live in megalopolises. I got to tell you, Catherine and I, my wife, we're out there in Burkittsville, Maryland, but we're near Frederick, which is maybe 40,000, 50,000 people now. That place functions like a 1950s small city. It's just filled with all the kinds of voluntary associations, people knowing each other, and you can get folks together in one room who can make a big difference what's going on in the community. It's Ozzie and Harriet and 1950s all over again in the best kinds of ways. I think that's true of small cities across America. I think it's true of smaller towns across America, where basically for a great many people in those communities, it works really, really well. And the problems are concentrated in a minority of the community that's still manageable. Maybe we say, let's make it easy as possible for people who like that kind of place to live in those kinds of places and to be given a lot of freedom to run their lives as they see fit. And maybe the cities are going to be run differently, and people who want to be in that kind of environment are, but we're never going to restore the kinds of institutions you're talking about.
Well, I do think that, and I argue in the book, that part of what makes America exceptionally good at having these small communities and be so productive is exactly the sort of federalism, the mobility, the ability to get, if you don't, I describe Orange City, Iowa, which is another one of these Dutch towns where they've got these Reformed churches, and I went and I started reading these online message boards, and I found this kid who said, it's just smothering here. Everybody knows your business. Anytime anything is happening with your family, people are knocking on the door and asking questions. And I'm thinking this sounds great, but I also understand how for an 18-year-old who, this could sound smothering. And then you're just realizing it's just so easy for him to get up and go. But at the same time, the irony of this is that what makes these little platoons, what makes institutions of civil society valuable is that they're not simply transactional. So the freedom to move about is part of what makes American communities so great. But communities are it's like my conservative idea of marriage, that it's not just a transaction, it's not something you enter into as long as it's useful and then you pull out. It's an actual commitment. It's a putting down of roots. So we need to have that combination, and I think America has just generally been good at having that combination where you can leave where you are, but there's lots of good soil in which to plant roots if you're not sort of feeling inclined immensely to get out and go.
Yeah, I will point out that what I'm edging toward with my statement about those two kinds of America is our libertarianism works real well in small city and small town America. It really, all of the feedback loops that you need to run civil society pretty much still occur there. I'll tell you where I get shaky in my libertarian principles is as I look at the megalopolises and I ask myself, is there any other way to run these except with a great deal of government interventionism and control?
Well, no, I think that there has to be. I mean, it's, I wrote a call, I'm like basically libertarian, but if you look at the Northeastern corridor's traffic problems, right? Like, you need massive government infrastructure projects, and they're probably going to have to be focused on rail just because you cannot move the necessary number of people. Now, I understand why my, readers in Texas are mad when I'm like, we got to do high-speed rail here. But, or we've got to do something that is going to move more people. We need more public transit because it doesn't make sense for their lives. But yes, I absolutely think that there is a much greater need for regulation and law in cities.
And that same concept is why there can be what I see as a vicious circle where more centralization begets more centralization. That the more that people... the more that the government is taking over roles. So you guys remember Jonathan Gruber of Obamacare fame. He's done multiple studies on government crowding out, and he had these really clever studies that found the places that got more money, more appropriations during the New Deal, they saw a much bigger drop-off in how the churches spent money on welfare. And so one of the things, you talked about the diner, one thing that draws people to church is that's where they get to serve other people. I remember thinking about this as I came into the church as an adult, and you're reading the Bible and it's saying, you have to feed the hungry. And I'm thinking, how am I even going to do that? Well, you show up at church and they say, on Tuesday we're going to the soup kitchen. But as the churches lose those roles, they lose some of their draw and some of their membership. So an institution disappears, and it's not just a church, it's a secular institution. That disappears, and then you need more government. And there's a study that showed the inverse correlation of regulation and social trust. And that the argument is that the causality goes both ways. And they say there's two equilibria. There's lots of regulation and low trust, or low regulation and lots of trust. And I was imagining this guy sort of walking on a razor edge. If you're trying to walk in the middle of moderate regulation, moderate trust, at some point you slip a little. There's less trust, you need more regulation. More regulation, less trust, and you just go down one way or the other.
If you talk about social trust, by the way, you were about to say?
No. Just looking at you.
That is the glue that holds communities together. It's almost as if it's a perfect storm. You've got the regulatory relationship with social trust. You've got the thing that nobody is happy about, which is as you get multi-ethnic groups in the same community, social trust tends to go through the floor. We live in a multi-ethnic nation. We're not going to change that, but it's a fact that it's a problem with social trust. Video games, which are now, you project out video games 10 years from now, you think about how attractive they are now as a way of escaping the real world. Imagine that extrapolated. There are all sorts of forces at work, from technological to cultural to economic, all of which are fighting against the very kinds of social interactions you want.
Yes, but so I agree. Social trust is really important in civ-earth. I'll be the devil's advocate for this panel, I guess. It's like, look, I belong to a bunch of different online groups for discussing various things, and on one of them, I have watched people who have never met each other in meet space, reaching out to each other to talk about their marital problems. People are going through a hard time. I have said to one person, you should go talk to this other person who went through this and talk to this third person. None of these people have ever met in the flesh, right? These are actually, these communities can be, and so video games is an example. Fortnite, which is this big thing, is parents can't get their, middle school boys off Fortnite. Well, it turns out that they're playing a game. But in fact, hardcore video gamers, or so I'm told by another adolescent boy who's a hardcore video gamer, they don't play Fortnite because Fortnite's just for chatting. So in fact, this is actually this big, it's a community. Now, these communities aren't like physical communities. Maybe they won't be as thick. Again, I actually think that this is a thing of outliers versus the median, is that the median's probably better off with meat space connections, but the outliers who have very weird preferences, wanting to be a libertarian blogger in 2001, can do stuff that they could not have done 20 or 50 or 100 years ago, right? But that may not be the equilibrium. We shouldn't extrapolate out what we see now. It is very possible that we will find new ways to form thick and durable connections and community online. We definitely haven't yet. I think that is true, and that there's a lot of toxic stuff going around. But on the scale of global human history, this is like an infant technology. It took us a while to get the hang of the printing press. We had a bunch of wars about religion as a result, but we eventually settled down, and we're doing pretty good with it now.
I think that's a good point. I agree with a lot of that.
Currently, the best thing technology does, in my opinion, is facilitate people getting together physically. I was able to have a 20th high school reunion only because Facebook existed. We build the group, we hunt down these people, and we all get together physically. And then otherwise, I just think about my parish and our kids' school, and it just makes it easier to, plan the 5K, to plan the T-ball team. All of that stuff is facilitated. But I also think that, as we were talking about sort of the immediate desires, that getting together physically with other people is not, it's not always obvious what the gains of that are. And so one of the perils of technology, if it says we don't actually have to get together, then when you don't get together, you lose the serendipitous encounters and conversations that end up being so valuable. This is what so much of new urbanism is about, right? Let's get people so they bump into their neighbors. Have a big courtyard in the middle of the block. Have a third place, a coffee shop, a barber shop, a bar where people can go. And that the more both technology and just wealth and the ability to have sort of a bespoke lifestyle where you only do everything you do and everywhere you go, it's deliberate and deliberately planned, then you don't get to just accidentally bump into people. And why was college the best time of so many people's lives? One reason is you were just there living next to people who had the same shared sort of aspirations and undertakings, the same pursuit that you were engaged in. And so that's one of my big worries about technology, is that if it makes it think, okay, well, now we can plan our lives, that's the fatal conceit for your own life. That's taking you away from the things you didn't realize were going to be so important to your own living your life, building virtue, being happy.
Okay, so you have a situation where we're going to have some really good outcomes because of the technological revolution and some really bad ones. I agree with Megan. We are just getting used to the capacities we have now in information technology, and we will adapt. Some of us will adapt. Some of us will do exactly as you were saying about using this as a way to facilitate actual physical communication. And things will get stronger, and we'll have a combination of virtual communities and real communities. There will be another set of people who do drop out altogether and are sitting in front of those screens in virtually a virtual reality machine that is a whole lot more exciting than the humdrum real world that they would otherwise live in. And maybe the reason that everything is so murky is we don't really know what the sizes of those different kinds of groups are going to be.
We don't, and I will say, I mean, like, I think that ultimately technology is going to have to foster thick rather than thin community in order to contribute to human thriving, right? I do think that is right. It is breaking up thick community in the real world, and that humans do need those things. I don't know, maybe the answer is that computers will get so good at simulating thick community that we can all like pretend we're living in a small town in 1910, and then it won't be a problem because we'll all individually feel very happy.
We haven't talked about politics yet. I wouldn't have written this book if Donald Trump weren't running away with the Republican nomination while I was looking at it. And those two places I named, Chevy Chase and Oostburg, Trump got 16% in Chevy Chase, which you could say, oh, it's a bunch of liberals. In the primary, a bunch of liberals, they all voted for Kasich. Trump got 16% in Oostburg. Oh, a bunch of Christian conservatives, they all voted for Cruz. Trump's worst state in the primaries, second worst state was Utah. His biggest drop-off from Romney to Trump was in all of these places, including Western Michigan, where, again, they're all Dutch people who go to church twice on Sundays in these incredibly strong Reformed churches. So the elites and these strong religious communities in the primaries rejected the guy who was saying the American dream is dead. So the argument that the American dream is dead was appealing to the alienated Americans, was my argument. That was the sense of his early core support, not the people who chose him over Hillary, but the people who, when there were 17 guys on stage and 20, however many terms of governorship and senatorship, said, that's the only guy who's willing to say the American dream is dead. Because where it seemed dead wasn't just because the factory had shut down. It's because everything had shut down, because they weren't connected to other people. But the next question you always get is, well, how is Trump fixing that? And this is where Robert Nisbet, a former AI scholar, his definition of alienation was, it's not just being disconnected from community and society, it's not even seeing the point in it. So then again, they turn towards a central government and a potential strongman. And I mean, so that was my political analysis. I want to know if you guys saw anything different.
I am so befuddled by American politics now. I have nothing useful to say. I just am appalled.
I think that there is a real sense in which, as these thick communities have broken down, And I think that they've broken down for liberals too. It's just that there are, even in places like Chevy Chase, I think that community is less thick than it used to be. I think the difference is that there are offsetting benefits that sort of mask a lot of that in some ways. But I think that, there is absolutely a phenomenon that you see on both sides of like people expecting politics to be everything.
Yep.
Right? Politics is not...
National politics.
National politics. And it's not even just like politics is going to make you healthy and it's going to take care of all your needs. It's like politics is going to fulfill all of your emotional needs.
It's what you belong to.
It is what you belong to. It is the only thing that matters. And so like I have these... I am firmly against this view of politics. I think it is like both an error in that politics cannot possibly fulfill this need and also profoundly unhealthy for our politics. But I will say this, and I will say things like you shouldn't lose a friend over politics, right? I mean, look, if you are in Nazi Germany in 1933, that does not apply. We're not living in Nazi Germany in 1933. But in general, right, if your friend was a decent person before they decided to vote for Trump, then you should, or before they decided to hate Trump or whatever it is you're mad about, you should understand, okay, well, they disagree with me about something. And we can talk about that, we can argue about it, whatever, but like ultimately I know all of these other things about this person beyond their vote, right? But I think that like we just don't have anything else that fulfills that place for people. And what it is, I mean, what's fascinating to me is how angry people get when I say that. It's like, they'll say, don't you understand? Some people don't have a choice about thinking about politics. I'm like, right, that's true. But, like the purpose of politics is to make people better off. And to make the most possible people happy. It cannot possibly be true that the most possible people are going to be happy if they spend every waking hour angry about politics and hating their neighbors.
Is politics a new religion?
Yeah, well,
yeah, I think in some ways.
It definitely is. And I pull on, I love pulling on the Greek. I pull on the Greek definition of politics, sort of meaning the public things, and that man is a political animal. And a lot of my libertarian friends don't like that if they take politics to mean this. That,
right.
Well, we're supposed to be legislating and regulating and all of that. But no, a simple libertarian-friendly way to put it is we are not supposed to just live our own lives according to what we think is right and wrong, but we are also supposed to shape the world around us. This is something I don't think I would have said in my teens or early 20s. But then when you're raising kids, you realize what's going on just in your own house and your literal backyard is not, shaping that is not enough. You have to shape the world around you. We have a parish. We have 2 other schools that our children go to. We belong to a swim club a couple years back that was incredibly strong. And there we could push and change rules or just change it by physically being the guy to be there and carry something from one side of the pool to the other. And even the intersection near our house, my wife and I lobbied our county government that they should change the way the lanes are set up. And they looked at it, and they did it. And it was this amazing thing for me who writes about national politics on how only the special interests get their ways. Here is the guy who lived around the corner said this would be, and they did it because it was on a local level. It was accessible. We could actually get in touch with the people. These different levels where I have so much ability through these institutions to shape the world around me, that's what's missing. That's what we have less of generally in America, but that's what's missing in the alienation, in the country that's alienated.
And I think the irony of it, right, is that our politics is so broken in part because everyone hates each other so much, right? You can't actually do anything through national politics because everyone's so angry.
Yeah.
So, like, in fact...
and just because there's 330 million people in this.
Right, but that's true. But, you could look back at the New Deal and say, like, we got angry, we elected FDR, we did something. If that's, if what you want to do, right, you can look at that and say this accomplished something. But like the fact that we hate our neighbors so much has created gridlock in Congress where everyone is just waiting to try to get control of the whole thing so that they can do whatever. Everything they do is non-durable at best and often just doesn't happen at worst. And so like everyone is pouring their hunger. I would put it a little differently. I wouldn't say that man is a political animal so much as a moral animal. So we need moral communities. People are pouring all their hunger for a moral community, for something that exists outside and beyond them and longer than they will, especially as they get older, that they're pouring that hunger into the one thing in America right now which doesn't hold out any promise of action, and by the act of investing so much in it, are making sure that it cannot do anything because, people become so determined to block their opponents.
There's a lot of arguments to be made that, in fact, politics does fill a role that religion used to fill. That it is the thing that the difficulty is that if you're talking about the great religions, I'll refer to Christianity, which is my tradition. These are religions that teach the right lessons in terms of loving and in terms of your moral responsibilities and all the right. So if you're deeply engrossed in those, in their best traditions, you are not filled with hate. You are not filled with anger and so forth. And politics, by its very nature, tends to make people angry and hostile and so forth. So insofar as that has become the religion of a secularizing society, the long-term outlook is not good.
Politics, the lesson of the Enlightenment, right, was that religious institutions don't make good governments, and government doesn't make a good religion. And I think that is something that America needs to relearn.
And again, people want to just sort of naturally, without even knowing it, want to exercise and flex their political muscles. And they think, and I think this is where Bernie Sanders and Occupy Wall Street came from. They say, why don't I have any ability to exercise my political muscles and shape the world around me? Because all they think of is Washington, D.C. So they say, oh, it must be because the special interests have too much control. And of course the special interests have too much control, but sort of the promise at the end of this is, at the end of the Bernie Sanders, I spent a night sleeping at Occupy Wall Street, and I tell the story in the book of how I just did not understand what they were talking about. Because there was an Occupy D.C., a couple of them here, and when I asked people what they were upset about, they said, well, the implementation of the Volcker rule is being toothless. It was these hippie wonks in drum circles here, up in Zuccotti.
Most of whom actually worked at OMB. So.
Up in Zuccotti Park, you'd say, what are you upset about? Well, it's that the wealthy and the banks have too much control over Washington. And I thought, common ground here, they're going to be against wars, against bailouts, against corporate welfare. So but what are the policies you don't like? Oh, well, the lack of campaign finance reform. Okay, but what else? Well, Citizens United. And then I'm like, okay, fine. All the special interests are in a closed room. It's smoke-filled. You are locked out because of all these other laws. What are they doing in that room that you dislike? And they said, well, making sure that the voice of the people isn't heard. And to me, it seemed like there's no there. There was no bottom. But it took me years later, writing about the alienation, to realize, no, that's a real complaint. That you don't have the ability. It's like you're reaching out. The image of the gym again. There's nothing to provide resistance. There's nothing to reach out and grab. It's just sort of you're there, standing alone, alienated, not able to shape the world around you, and you think the problem is that there are super PACs that are spending too much money.
Should we go to questions?
Yeah, so we questions now from the audience. We have a microphone that will come over to you. So, sorry, are the microphones working? So why don't we start right up here in front? Red jacket. No, that's...
Not working.
No, there we go.
Oh, there we go. I'd like to get to the subtitle of the book, Why Some Places Thrive and Others Collapse. And I identify as a Midwesterner, actually from Wisconsin. And when I was back there last summer, I was in a town called Ripon. Thinks of itself as the home of the Republican Party, with a well-known small liberal arts or some kind of college. And the elementary school in downtown had been converted to small independent senior living. because there are no kids, and people who lived in the country with farms, etc., were moving to town to live collectively. And that's what's happening in sort of rural Iowa, rural Wisconsin, doesn't really matter where. So the question is, part of it is because there used to be small manufacturing throughout Wisconsin, factories with 100, 300, 400 people. They fed the paper industry, they fed the coffee pot industry. These small factories were increasingly bought out by bigger companies like Kimberly-Clark that became global companies. So I'm wondering, when you talk about why some places thrive and why they collapse, if it isn't also in part the loss of small farming and small manufacturing.
Thank you. I think that's a huge part of it. Often it's the first domino, but I have a shuttered church rather than a shuttered factory on the front of the book for a reason, because I think that the real efficient cause, the main cause, is the collapse of the other institutions that follow. And one contrast I paint in the book is between Pittsburgh and then Uniontown, Pennsylvania. Uniontown is in Fayette County. It's about 45 minutes, an hour south of Pittsburgh. Both of these places were devastated by the steel industry moving over to first Europe and then China. Pittsburgh is doing well now. Fayette County and Uniontown are not. They are, it's this, and Uniontown, Fayette County is rural, but Uniontown was a real city, 20, 30,000 back in the day. Why were they not able to survive the downturn? And my argument is that if you've been to Pittsburgh, you know there's all these little neighborhoods. A lot of them are built around church. A lot of them are sort of ethnically distinct. You have the Jewish neighborhood of Squirrel Hill. You've got Polish and Italian neighborhoods and Irish neighborhoods. You've got all these different neighborhoods and all these churches and these other institutions, including a local public school where everybody there thinks of the kids there as our kids, while the places that are just a little more spread out, they're thinner. They have a church or two, but when the factory shuts down, it's just less resilient. I sort of imagine it, the rural communities were resting on a thinner membrane that was easier to snap because they didn't have as dense networks of civil society. So you obviously can't tell this story without telling the story of the shutting factories. And in chapters 2 through 4, I go through a lot of that. But you're skipping a step if you go from this factory closed to the opioid epidemic. You're skipping the step of this factory closed, and it couldn't stay together because then the other institutions closed. So, yes, right there, Zoe. Sorry, the mic, we'll get that working in 1 second.
See, technology is a problem.
We're still adapting.
We're still adapting.
So I had two clarifying questions. There was one part where you said there's an increased social distrust because of video games and also an influx of ethnic communities, and I was wondering if you could explain, go into that more.
What was I referring to there?
Yeah.
The research that initially established this is actually by Robert Putnam, who wrote Bowling Alone. And so he was subsequently doing additional work, and what he found was that when you had multi-ethnic communities, that social trust became very low. And it's not just that one ethnicity did not trust another ethnicity. Mm-hmm. Trust within the ethnicities also declined. And that this was a very consistent finding, and it has since seen a lot of replication. I think I've seen a couple of articles that have seen some glimmers of hope, that some communities that it's not as universal as was initially thought. I think the bulk of the literature continues to say this seems to be a built-in problem, There are lots of reasons that it shouldn't surprise us, but it's a problem in a multi-ethnic country as we are.
It's much less of a problem in very affluent communities because there's a kind of, if you've been socialized to college anywhere, you have a lot. First of all, you're more likely to have a common language, which Tim talks about in the book, but you also just have that there's globally a fairly common college ethos. But that's not where the bulk of immigration in the United States is, and so this always seems like a very surprising finding to upper middle class educated people, because that's not a finding that you would replicate in a suburb that has a very diverse population of college educated people. It's a finding that you're more likely to have in communities that are a lot thicker, have been there where one community, something like Charlestown in Boston, where you have basically, this is where my family came in 1850 and squatted until about 1940, right? It's like people have just been there for a long time, education levels are lower, they have very thick ideas about the way to do things that are theirs, and they don't like outsiders.
Well, it's hard to have cohesion and strong community if you don't share enough. So if you come to my parish, it's incredibly ethnically diverse. It's got, not in Chevy Chase. If you go to Blessed Sacrament, the only diversity is which president nominated you to the Supreme Court. If you come to St. Andrews in Silver Spring, it's got incredible diversity, strong cohesion, because even the non-Catholics there have invested in the Catholic education of their children. So there is that strong cohesion. I write about this problem. The most cheering follow-up study that sort of disagrees a bit with Putnam says maybe it's not the diversity that leads to the loss of cohesion, but it's a transition period. So that's sort of an uplifting interpretation of it. But I talk about the Tower of Babel. It's harder to build community if you don't speak the same language. But then also the difference in customs. I have a neighbor who lives next door, Mr. Patel. And so just a quick passage here. After a few months of driveway chats, and Mr. Patel occasionally giving me a ride to the metro, I invited him for a beer on my back deck. This is the most normal way I get to know a guy. But Mr. Patel, for religious reasons, he's a Hare Krishna, doesn't drink alcohol. That's admirable, but that creates a barrier to our bonding. So coffee, no. Tea, nope. Herbal tea, sorry. So after months of frustration, I approached him with a very awkwardly direct question. I said, Mr. Patel, I would like to have you over for a drink, but what liquids do you actually consume? I have some lime LaCroix in my house. No dice. He said the waste of putting water in cans and bottles violated his religious obligation to care for creation. So finally he suggested water with some lemon or lime in it. So I sent my kids off to the grocery store to pick up a lemon and a lime, filled a couple big pitchers with water, later in the night put my children to bed, and then Mr. Patel and I finally got to know each other on my back deck over many glasses of gently citrified water. This shows that it isn't impossible to bridge these cultural gaps, but that it takes a lot more effort and it has a lot of potential pitfalls. It's reasonable to infer then that cultural differences tend to weaken community bonds. And I say, what if at our cookouts, what if we're serving pork? Then can we invite our Muslim neighborhoods? We live in a very Jewish community. There was one time where we actually used our grill. I, at a mistake, bought a third charcoal grill for our house. It was at a parish auction where they also had beer because we're Catholics. And we kept it as a kosher grill for exactly one cookout. But so these beautiful cultural differences that make diversity as sort of thrilling and exciting as it is also then make it a little more work to build the cohesion. But that's why sort of if you all share, we all went to college or we're all Catholics raising our kids, and that allows you, that makes it easier to get over that hump.
I mean, I will say that like in the 50s, the big thing in Boston was for the Italian and the Irish Catholics, high school boys, to rumble at football games. And now they're all living on the North Shore and they're united in their hatred of the hipsters. So, it's totally possible to overcome these things. It just does take work.
Yes, let's go up front. Is that the working microphone?
We're all good. So first of all, this book is just fantastic, and everybody in this room needs to buy it. He didn't pay me to say that.
Multiple
It's just true.
copies. Give them as gifts.
Come back to the ethnicity thing, though. You talk relatively little about race in the book, and these towns that you hold out as models of working or middle class civic cohesion. To me, as a Northeasterner, coming not from my grandparents' generation, but my generation, they sound kind of quaint because they'll have one white ethnicity. We don't really have much white ethnicity left. My dad grew up in an Irish neighborhood, but this is just no longer the case. So if these places that still have this thing have preserved this kind of remarkable seeming blast from the past, these ethnic cohesions, what hope do you have? Ethnic and religious sort of overlap too, right? These communities united by
it's Dutch reform. Yeah.
What do you see as the most plausible sources of civic cohesion for communities that don't start out with those natural, if I can call them, advantages?
Yeah, no, I think it's good that you have sort of this forward-looking thing. In the past, we had the Italian neighborhood in Pittsburgh, et cetera, and that. Quick political point. One of the best predictors of how much Trump support in an early primary, again, with 17 guys on stage, was a number of people who, when asked their ancestry, just said American. So not having ethnicity made you more likely to vote for Trump, I argue, because it enhanced sort of the sense of alienation, less religion, less roots. And so, but, I mean, again, Megan's more optimistic, so maybe she can offer that. But I do think that other forms of identity come and replace it. One thing you see, hipsters were mentioned earlier, you do see a lot of people now really developing pride in a specific neighborhood. When I moved to D.C. in 2000, sort of there was a little bit of difference what side of Capitol Hill you lived on, but there was certainly no pride. Now it's, we're Petworth people, or I would never live in Park Slope. That's way too shishi. We're Carroll Gardens people, and then in small cities like Grand Rapids, I'm so cheered when I see. I mean, Grand Rapids is another one of these Dutch places, but also just a ton of 20-something hipsters with just real Grand Rapids pride. I bet there's people with Grand Rapids tattoos walking around there, and they love the local beer scene and the local food truck scene and all of that stuff. So I do think that there can be a renaissance just in that, and sort of we are a neighborhood, and we're going to have real pride in that.
Yeah, well, I'm a proud Eckingtonian. I haven't gotten my tattoo yet, but I think that it is complicated, right? America's racial legacy is its original sin. And like the ordinary sort of original sin, it is not going to be extirpated very easily. It is going to require some sort of incredible heroic sacrifice. Are we willing to make that sacrifice? What form does that sacrifice take? I think, run this metaphor far beyond where we'll go, and I'm now going to drop it. But that I think that there is absolutely hope. But I think that periods of enormous social change are not good periods to kind of try to predict what things are going to look like in 20 years. And we are in a period of just unusually rapid economic, social, political, everything change, technological change. And I don't know where it ends up, so I don't know how to even frame what the communities that will fulfill these needs and for which groups. But I will simply say that I think it is obviously America's great moral obligation to make the benefits of Oostburg available to help in what ways it can. It's hard. I don't know what the answers there are, but in what ways it can to make it possible for African Americans to form places that are not just that socially thick, because there are a lot of very socially thick African American neighborhoods. The real challenge is the kind of stable economic prosperity, which has been much, much harder for African American neighborhoods to achieve because of race, of our legacy of racism.
Well, and while there has been a lot of social capital in some ways in inner city African American neighborhoods, I talked earlier about the forces that act to pull people apart. And when we look at it's easy to think of our racial history and slavery and segregation and just talk about taking away rights from black people, taking away their access to other institutions. But part of it was a deliberate attempt to prevent solidarity.
To prevent family formation.
Yeah, to prevent family formation and solidarity. So in other words, a huge part of the oppression, the racial oppression that happened to blacks in America was the powers that be keeping them from forming little platoons that would provide sort of a robustness. And so it was the church, the black church in the end that provided, it was an institution. We talk about these great men, Martin Luther King. It was institutions that ended the worst of the segregation, and that was part of why there was distrust and efforts to break up the family and break up those institutions. Yeah, right here in the middle.
One, thank you for mentioning that. That's usually glossed over. Two, can you explain why in a zero-sum world this collapse that you're talking about is not just a useful tool? Why is it something that actually needs to be addressed, considering that maybe there isn't much use for these populations that we're talking about economically? And I've heard that said. So
yeah, no, and so this is one of the worst things that you sometimes encounter in the world of sort of policy making is people say, well, you know what? The economy grew while our factories went overseas. These people lost their jobs and sort of faded out of usefulness, but we're doing fine. And then because we're wealthier, we can have a bigger safety net, and we can catch these people as they fall. And I had friends sort of say explicitly that, because it was their argument against a sort of a Trumpian protectionism of the factories. Isn't it better to just sort of let these towns collapse and catch them with the safety net? And yeah, yeah. And so I've said it before. I'm a Catholic and a Christian, and I think that every human being is of infinite value, and we simply cannot allow that sort of thing to happen. And that's why I get passionate about this particular question, because I think that the plague of alienation is not sort of loneliness and people are sad. I think it's a dehumanization of people when they don't have the ability to connect to others. And sort of the economies of that allowed these small factory towns to exist and then form a local diner and a local church and all that stuff. Those were literally lifting people up, lifting up their souls to be aspiring to something better. And if we're not letting them aspire to, if we're not giving them the avenue to pursue these greater goods, it really is a disservice. So if we somehow get wealthier while we let people slip through the cracks, we're failing as a country. And one more question is what we have time for. So where's the mic right now? So what's that? Oh, you have both of them? Okay, right there then.
I think this discussion reminds me of Russell Kirk's comment that piety dives on pavement. And I didn't used to think that in Brooklyn and Chicago of old, but maybe it's true. I've been looking at some studies in the 19th century and the 20th century of contacts of primitive tribes with modernity. And as soon as they contacted, everybody sort of falls apart into drinking, alcoholism, not working. All very isolated tribes this happens to. That's why now when they find them in Amazon or New Guinea, they don't just go in there with TV sets. Is the pace of modernity making all of us like those primitive tribes so that it keeps coming so that we have the same sort of future shock, if you will, even though we're modern?
J.D. Vance has a passage, a very brief passage in Hillbilly Elegy like that, where he talks about his ancestors from Jackson County, Kentucky, and then and how just, as you're saying, there's no privacy. There's somebody always showing up, some sister-in-law telling you how to parent. People are on top of you. They get on the hillbilly highway, they call it, and go up to this suburb, gridded suburb, where everybody has a house and a yard and a fence. And he says, it was a world completely different yet the same. It was different because you were now separate and not so connected. But it was the same because we were all still hillbillies. In other words, there was that culture shock. They hadn't adapted to a different way of living. And without that intense connection, that was actually one of the passages that really made me realize I had to write this book. Without that connection, they were living in a culture that theoretically was survivable and could lift people up, but not with, if you're brought up with sort of different habits and you have a different set of needs and a different way of reaching out and aspiring to something greater.
And maybe the optimistic, maybe we can end on an optimistic
yes,
note. Maybe what's happened is, like the Amazonian tribes, confronted with all of this new weird stuff, we sort of forget what's important. But that doesn't mean it isn't important. So if you say it is true, it is objectively true, that human beings flourish in contact with other human beings, that marriage objectively is one of the most rewarding forms of human intimacy. If you go through a variety of other things about basic human needs and how human beings work and say these are true, and so we can afford to say an awful lot of what we're seeing now is anomalous. It is behavior that has been pulled out of shape by culture shock, by technological shock, and sooner or later, those things which are true about human beings will shape human institutions.
Yeah, I think that is right. It's Valentine's Day, so I'm always getting my my former columns thrown up to me, including one that I wrote on a sort of disastrous relationship that I had that isn't the reason I now live in Washington, D.C. instead of New York, where the relationship took place. I made the mistake of going on NPR to talk about it for their Valentine's Day economics issues. So every year they retweet it, and I get another, because it really goes into great length about all of my bad decisions. But, the interesting thing is that also every year it triggers like an argument between the feminists and the men's rights advocate people that just takes place without me. Like I'm just unfortunately sitting in the middle of a really angry tweet storm. And I mean, like, ultimately, a lot of what you notice from the conversations back and forth is that, like, both sides are kind of trying to get the same thing. They want the other side to be maximally committed so that they will have something to fall back on, and they wish to make as little commitment as they can, right? Because that would, it would be better if they could get someone else to commit to them without doing the same thing in return. And I think that ultimately, we're humans, we want silly things like this, but that's not a stable equilibrium. And eventually you evolve social norms that figure that out. And I think that is true of romance. I think that's true of a lot of things, is that ultimately you have to have norms that will enable people to get what they need. And if those norms don't work for long enough, and as it happens in my book, I actually looked at an Amazonian tribe they were hunter-gatherers, and they had huge collective sharing norms, but unfortunately their terrain was being so encroached that they couldn't support themselves as hunter-gatherers. So they were moved onto farms. And they literally had rules. They were so high on sharing that they actually had rules that a man could never eat the meat he himself had hunted. They told them that if they ate it, they would lose their virility and be unable to hunt. And so they try to do this when they're farming. And the anthropologist who's telling me about this said, every morning they would ring a bell for everyone to go out in the fields together. About 3 mornings in, they rang the bell and no one showed up. And so they actually just had to evolve new norms that were about property, that were about, like, this is my patch, and the stuff in my patch is mine, and you can't have it, me and my family here. And it happened rapidly. Right, that's the kind of amazing thing, is that it wasn't like they didn't really believe these things. They were as fundamental to their belief system as our belief that, like, my yard is mine and you can't come on it unless I let you, is as fundamental to our society. But they changed because their circumstances changed. So I have tremendous belief, both in the kind of short-term unwisdom of people, but in our long-term ability to evolve and adapt to new shocks, and to build things that really do work and are enduring and connect us to those moral communities that take us outside and beyond ourselves.
Thank you.
That's a good note to end on. Thank you for that. And what a great discussion. We could go on all day, but we won't. Charles, Megan, Tim, thanks very much. And per our usual practice here, this will be available. It's been live streamed. It'll be available online for you to send out through your various social media preferences. And once again, the book table's out there. Don't leave without a copy. Thanks for coming.
By the way, Tim, I have to get you to sign my book.
Oh, yeah.